All right. So we want to start like we did last week with how did you listen this week? And especially we want to ask, what did you hear from someone else? How did you listen to another person in your life in such a way that you heard? And it doesn't necessarily have to be I got this great spiritual wisdom because I listened. It can be smaller things. It can even be bad things. What did you listen to this week? Who did you listen to?
Well, this week alone with Toastmasters, it's been one contest after another. Twice a year, Toastmasters has what they call international speech contests. And what happens is that out of each contest comes one winner, of course, and then they begin to participate in the world-class international speech contest. So all week I've been a judge. I've also been a chief judge and not a contestant, but a timer and ballot counter. So I've been listening to a lot of speeches, and I tell you what, I enjoyed the speeches because each speech is different and they all have their own thoughts behind it.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is that, of course, we're all different and everybody has a different way of presenting their ideas. So I pay close attention.
Yeah.
And what did I get out of it? Some wisdom,
Right.
more understanding of the importance of what we call interpersonal communications.
Sure.
I really enjoyed it.
And at least part of the challenge, though, about that is you have to try to figure out how to
Wait a minute, I haven't got it.
to sort through the different voices that are there. Because I mean, it can be overwhelming, all of those voices at once, so that you end up shutting your ears and not really hearing any of them. And that's not what you want to do.
Yeah. As a judge in a contest, so you really have to pay attention to make sure that
Sure.
all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. So
Yeah.
listening, it really becomes very important.
Judy,
Pick a
Judith,
winner.
welcome. Siri, good to have you here.
Hi.
We're talking about what did you listen to this last week, or more specifically, who did you listen to and what did you hear from them? Who else would like to talk?
I was thinking about listening today, and I realized that I had some interesting experiences recently with listening when I was in the room where I have these two little baby box turtles, and during this construction, and I had my computer in there for a couple of weeks, and I started hearing this funny little tiny sound, like just something, you know, like gnawing at something. Or it was hard to make out what it was. It was such a tiny little sound. And then suddenly I turned around and realized one of the baby turtles was munching on some cuttle bone. And it was really interesting because, of course, it gave me a signal about what that one needed in the way of food and so forth. But I noticed that little sounds like that sometimes are big signals. And if I'm not really paying attention, they just go right by me.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is that if you'd been in your regular place, your regular way of interacting with them, you wouldn't have heard that.
Yeah.
Or it would have been harder for you to hear that. And suddenly, just by placing yourself in a different room, whether it was forced on you or not, suddenly you heard differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. How about the rest of you? Who did you listen to and what did you hear?
Well, I mentioned yesterday that I listened to this pastor guy on Sunday, and he had talked
Careful about what you listen to is what she's saying. Sorry.
And so he mentioned that Anne Lamott new book, The Dusk, Night, and Dawn. Yeah, and so I ordered it, and I really enjoyed that. And so I think that you know, you can get great ideas from friends or pastors or pastor friend in many ways besides just the message of the sermon, which was good too. But these little extra side views are also kind of cool. And yeah, and you know, this wind is like crazy. Have you noticed all the sounds that the wind is making these days? Now, it's not a person, but it's certainly causing a lot of unusual sounds than normal. So Sue, how about you? Did you hear anything special?
Well, couple of things. A friend and I were discussing the situations in the world and the prejudice. I know you won't know that I'm that this old, but I will tell you, she and I have been friends for 71 years. And she's a Jewish gal. And not until this week did I realize how much anti-Semitism there is. When she and I were talking, I'm thinking to myself, I listen pretty well. I've always been pretty good, but gosh, I didn't realize that she and her faith group and all have gone through so much. Just, it was just amazing to me. And I was going to tell you something else and I've forgotten it. So it'll come back to me.
If it comes back.
Okay.
Oh, I got it. I watched Anne Lamott was on Hoda and Jenna yesterday.
Nice.
Really?
Immediately went to Amazon, ordered her book, and sent one to a friend because that was one of our daily practices in the Lenten class that I'm in.
Yeah.
But anyway, she's a character and a half, which I've already known, but I loved her. She showed her pink sparkly fingernails and she slammed her finger in the car door.
Oh,
And has a bruise on one of her nails, which is not the best nail, but it has this bruise on it. And her husband looked at it and he goes, oh, that bruise is in the shape of a Buddha.
Interesting.
So he's Buddhist.
Okay.
And so she says, so now I have to listen to him and his teachings. And not only that, but he keeps reminding me to look at my fingernail because Buddha's with me. So she's very interesting.
Interesting.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So
okay.
You know, one of the things that's nice about Anne Lamott, I'm going to share some of my prejudice, is that she's as a Christian writer, she's very honest compared to many, right? Sometimes Christian writers have to clean themselves up a lot.
yeah,
Right? She does not clean herself up.
she doesn't.
She bears her soul completely.
And the other thing that I love that she's calling this time in our history, she's calling it COVID college. Because we are learning so much.
Mm-hmm.
So true.
And I thought that's a great way to talk about this time in more of the positive than maybe in the negative. So
Yeah, because we feel the negative, but the
Yeah.
question of how's it working in us in positive ways is
Right.
a good question, right?
yeah, so I like that term.
Well, that ongoing listening is an important thing. The struggle with listening to the crowd is that we often forget one voice in the crowd, and that is our own. Sometimes we get really good at listening to all those experts around us, or the opposite, all those people that are the anti-expert, and so we can yell at them. And we forget to listen to ourselves. Because we are part of the crowd, right? We are part of the way that God can speak in the world, and we sometimes overlook that in the midst of everything else. And so that's what this week is about listening to ourselves. And she starts off this chapter with the section on the still small voice, which is a term that I've known since I was a child, only we often turn the still small voice into that voice of God, the Holy Spirit voice. She's asking us to hear that voice in our own voice. And maybe it's the divine voice speaking through us, but to listen to ourselves. And she calls it our higher self, our wiser self, and inviting that guidance. But to do that, there's one important element. You have to admit that the present day self doesn't listen to everything perfectly, doesn't have all the answers. doesn't do all the, doesn't have right now all the perspective and views to be able to look. And how many sometimes act as if that's true, that I'm pretty good right now, I don't have to listen to. Or you get too busy that you don't listen to. And all the stuff of life gets in the way of hearing. But when is it that you've stepped beside what she called the present moment self? That self that she says is not all knowing. And when is it that you've listened to the larger self that you are?
In reading her book,
what?
Particular chapter, remember her talking about taking a walk and listening to yourself. And the walking was kind of the best exercise you could find, because as you walk, of course, you're listening and you're talking to your inner self.
Uh-huh.
I found that quite interesting, because I myself at times when I'm driving am doing the same thing.
Yeah.
I like the peace and quiet inside my automobile as I drive from place to place or where I'm going. And I find myself actually talking to myself.
Uh-huh.
Sad, sometimes I answer myself. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But the key thing is to listen to yourself. And you're right, Jim. Listen to yourself, your higher self. What's going on?
Well, and the tough part is, Juan, is finding that time to do that, because I know you and Sarah take walks together, which is a good thing to be able to do. But I'm guessing that if Sarah's on that walk with you, you're not just listening to your own voice.
Right. I think in the book it mentioned walk by yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And that's at least part of the message from this section, is that you have to find and literally make time to be able to be by yourself. And she would say daily. Susan, the answer to your question, the one book that we've been talking about is this one. It doesn't show up very well. It's called Dusk, Night, Dawn. That's by Anne Lamott. That's her newest book. But in my mind, one of her best books is a book called The Traveling Mercies, which is a very powerful book about her life. But she's done several books. There's none of them that I think have been a bad book.
Can I just share my favorite one, Jim?
Yes.
It's called Help, Thanks, Wow.
Well, that is.
And those are the three different types of ways of praying. When you're asking for help, you're saying your thanks and you're expressing your wowness of creation or whatever is happening in your life. But do you want to get started on the introduction, the tools, Jim? Or do we want to share any more?
I kind of slipped into that area.
Okay.
I think the important thing about this chapter was, all the different sections were good, and we'll get to those, but this beginning section was very powerful. The tools that it carried for us to be able to listen to ourselves were wonderful. But then I'm going to tell you too, and we'll get to this at the end, I think that the different try this, as opposed to last week where the try this were okay, there's some really good exercises here. And so if you didn't do them last week, do them these next couple of weeks. Because remember, next week we won't have a class. Okay. And so you have 2 weeks to be able to read the next chapter. Use part of that time at least to do some of these exercises deeper, because there's some marvelous things that are there to be able to delve deep into listening to yourself. The hard part about listening to yourself is it often means that you have to listen differently than what you did. At one point she said, the answers to our deepest questions are often whispered. I think that was a quote that she put in there. And I think what she means by that is they're not in the way that you've learned how to listen well, so you have to listen differently. Okay. And so let me expand that just a little bit. When she says whispered, if you're used to a whole lot of silence, that might be, you might have gotten really used to listening to a certain type of voice out of that silence. So you might need to listen to a space that's noisier. So you learn to listen differently. If you've learned how to listen in a space of softness, you might need to go sit on a hard rock somewhere, right? You have to learn how to listen differently to hear how yourself, and especially the self that is trying to speak right now, how it is speaking to you. Because if you're like most of us, you'll too often go back and hear the same voice you've already heard. And it's not that that's a bad voice, but if you're trying to hear bigger, differently, then you have to choose how to hear in a new way, right? That's why when we look at our elder self, that wise one of our future is a good person to look at, to listen to, but sometimes the wise one is from our past that's saying, hey, quit being incautious. Be more like your 18-year-old self and throw caution to the wind. Go and explore. Go and dive off the cliff, which is sometimes something that we that are a bit more on the old side of life, not old, a bit more on that side of life. That's a voice that we need to sometimes listen to, because it's become easy for us to be cautious, hasn't it?
She talks about tools in the opening chapter. And if you have your book, I'm on page 112. Yeah, 113. And when she's talking about the still small voice and the Obi-Wan Kenobi and the prayer, the praying and the writing questions, the believing mirrors, that those are all tools that could help us get to answers. And I wanted to add my own tool that sort of came to me today when I was out walking. I'm in an area where there's a lot of trees, and I noticed just how a tree is rooted and is reaching at the same time. It's going deep and it's going high. And so I painted these trees, and I thought, you know, you could take something that is a thing rather than just thinking higher self, like, you know, the angel on your shoulder, that it becomes a visual that might help you connect with a question that you have. You know, just going in your head to your higher self, for me, doesn't always work. But when I was walking with the trees today, they became plural higher selves that made me think about, well, where am I going? What am I reaching for above? And then what am I reaching for below in this question of, well, I'm in retirement now. What's next? I've been asking myself that a lot. So I was kind of asking the trees.
Yeah.
And so I just want to put that out there as another tool for finding your higher self answers.
And Sarah, Nancy, that happened because you were by yourself, able to open yourself up to that.
Mm-hmm.
If, like with Juan, if you've got that Sarah voice around you, sometimes you're trying to hear that Sarah voice, which is not necessarily a bad voice, but it makes it so that you might miss that the whispering of the trees that day that might be trying to tell you. And so that's the hard part, is trying to figure out how to hear in each moment, not what you have heard, but what's next to hear. I love the Rumi quote that she used, where you have to let yourself be drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. And so to do that, you have to be in that space where you go, look at this, and you follow that.
Or even adding to that, Jim, follow what moves you.
Yeah.
And you have to, you know, what does move you, and how do you follow what moves you? I think that's a nice question.
So here's the bad part about that, is it often says, don't keep being in the comfortable space. Don't keep walking on the path that you walked on yesterday, but, and I mean that both metaphorically and in truth, walk in the new space that may be calling out to you. Listen in the new way, maybe become something different, right?
Kind of like shedding your skin like a snake will do. It sheds its skin and it becomes something new in that way. Like, what are we shedding? And what are we embracing that's underneath that?
And that's a really good image, because what this doesn't mean is, it doesn't mean that what you had was bad. It's what you're moving towards that you're trying to listen for. Not because you're rejecting, but because you're moving further. Let me give you an example. How many have ever taken the Myers-Briggs test? Myers-Briggs test is a very simple personality test. It scores you on 4 different spectrums. One of them is introvert, extrovert. When Joni and I took this, when we were doing a couples class together, we found out that on 3 of the 4 spectrums, we are far apart from each other. I mean, like completely on the opposite ends of everything. But on the 4th thing, we're closer to the center, both of us. And that's the one that's TF, thinking and feeling. The first few times that I took this test, I always scored on the thinking side. But as I've taken it later in my life, I've scored more and more on the feeling side. I think that's because this is where I naturally am. But when I was younger and closer to my training time, closer to my education time, then I had adapted to more of the thinking skills that allowed me to show up more on this side. And that was a good thing. I'm not trying to say that's bad, but I also have to say, maybe thinking is not the most important thing for me, and finding out how I feel might be reaching my deeper self. And so you have to figure out what it is that maybe was good before, but that now needs to take a step back. So you can listen to what is it that can be developed right now to be used in this moment. So I'm sure none of you have ever had to change direction and figure out a new place, but that's part of listening to it, isn't it? It's saying, what are the skills for now, not the skills that were good for yesterday. When have you had to do that?
I had to do it fairly recently.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, as you were sharing, both you and Nancy, sometimes those changes are not by our choice.
Changes are sometimes thrust upon us, aren't they?
Yep, we have to think of new ways because something has changed in our life, but you still have to listen to that inner voice on how you're going to handle it.
Let me give you a good example of that. I think I've told you before about, well, I know I've told you about my mom, but I don't know if I told you about her and my grandmother. My mom was the primary caregiver for my grandma for the last 15 years of her life, as she was dealing with Alzheimer's. And became increasingly more incoherent to her younger self and to my mom. And frankly, I thought my mom was going to die before my grandmother from the strain of that caregiving. And part of it was because my grandmother began calling my mom, whose name is Trudy, began calling her Maggie. Maggie was my grandmother's twin sister. And my mom loved her Aunt Maggie, but she did not want to be her Aunt Maggie. She didn't want her, she wanted to be seen as the daughter that she was. And so the struggle of dealing with that was literally killing my mom. And when she was able to let go of having to convince her mother of who she was, it changed everything for her. She began to re-find her own strength, but it meant she had to unlearn something that she knew was absolutely true. She was Trudy, she was not Maggie. She didn't want to be Maggie, but she had to unlearn that at least in dealing with her mom at that stage of life. That was a listening that she had to do, a hard listening. And it made her a better caregiver. It made those last few years with grandma much easier. And Sue, like you say, you've had to figure out some things like that. Some of them not lessons you want to learn.
Mhm.
But you don't get to all the time go back to yesterday's world. And the skills of yesterday's world are not always what are needed in the present moment. At least part of us wants to return to 2019, kind of like what Anne Lamott said in her book. Let's go back to that. But the reality is if we just do that in this moment, what do we miss? How do we listen to our higher selves and what our higher selves can be in this moment? So the image that she gave specifically was of Obi-Wan Kenobi, which she also said Glinda the Good Witch. Nancy thought maybe Yoda was a good image, but it's something in you that speaks bigger, differently, maybe very differently than how you speak normally in this moment in your life, but that is speaking wisdom to you. How do you hear that wisdom? And maybe just as importantly, what gets in your mind of listening, of hearing that wisdom?
Judy?
Go ahead, Judy.
Well, as some of you know, I've shared this openly recently, is my childhood was not, it was abusive and violent and chaotic. And as abused kids, I've done research on it, I've studied it and taught abused kids and taught people who work with abused kids. And they're always hyper vigilant. You learn to read people. But I guess I learned to listen to my inner voice as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been something that I've relied on, I guess, from a very, very early age, from everything. And even my recent move in with Joyce was listening to an inner voice in me go, well, she keeps talking about this situation she's in. Should I mention this? That it's like, what do you think about this? What do you think about the possibility of this? Do you think if you think it's too far out, just throw it away. But, what do you think about this? And I thought, don't do it. It's like, it's crazy and stuff. But finally it was insistent enough. And we kept talking about her, everything. And I decided finally to just go for it. And I said, what do you think about me moving in with you and sharing expenses? And that way you don't have to sell the house. And it was like, it just morphed hugely from there to where now I'm here. I'm living with Joyce. And I just feel like my spirit's soaring. It's like I can't even tell you how much my life is changing and opening up. And it's one of the best moves I've made in a long time, but I've done that my whole life. I've always kind of listened. I've left a lot of situations in my life that I felt were toxic to me. And it's just something I always trust, that if I need to move out of something towards something else, that I will do it.
Yeah. And the hard part about that, Judy, is that if your life taught you only distrust, then when it gets to this space where here's a good place to trust, it makes it challenging. So thank you for being courageous and stepping into that place, because sometimes distrust of what life has done to us is an important thing, right? If you are a victim of abuse, you have learned that some trust should not be given.
Well, that's come through a lifetime in my college years and as a young adult, running into and trusting counselors who worked with me and made sense and helped to guide me away from some negative patterns, so into really positive patterns.
Yeah.
But I think I had a lot of that. I don't know. Even as a little girl, I felt there's something in me that can handle anything. And I know I'm going to trust myself to do this.
Yeah. And you should trust yourself. And that's exactly what this is about. Even when yourself leads you down roads that are different than what self led you to last year, right? Self continues, that higher self, that elder is continually trying to find the next important thing for us, not the lesson we've already learned, right? What's the next space for us to be? And it's going to be weird sometimes. So let me tell you a story of what happened to me. This was 5 years ago or so when I brought our youth group down to San Luis. San Luis is across the border from Mexico, and we helped build a house down there. And at that point, I'd been going down to San Luis almost weekly during part of the time I was in Yuma. Probably went there a couple hundred times, and I know how internet things work down there. I never got internet until I got to Somerton, which is about 10 miles north of the border. But suddenly I'm getting in line and my internet works. And the hard part is I'm getting in line way back. I've gotten there enough times that I know that Avenue 20 is about a 2.5 hour wait. And that's where the backup was. So I knew we were in for a long wait. And suddenly my phone rings. And I go, I don't want to answer it because I won't be able to, it won't be very good internet. But I answered it, and it was my wife. And we began to talk. And essentially in those 2.5 hours, doing something that I'd learned not to do, and that was expect a phone call from the United States, I essentially bought the house we're living in, right? Which she had found. And she said, trust me on this. And do I listen to that voice? Do I do the work in a space that was very space that I typically wouldn't trust, right? Because it's not a space where you have good communication, but sometimes that's what you have to do. You have to say, in this case, maybe not even Nick's trip to Mexico, it won't work, but in this case, this phone call is working. In this moment, this is the right way forward. And can you listen to it? Can you listen to that voice in that moment? So what stops you from listening to that voice? What are the filters you put on? What are the other ways you've gotten used to listening? Why don't you listen to your own voice? What do you trust better than your voice?
Well, in my case, my training in the church that I attended as a child, I got to learn a lot of Bible verses. We had to memorize every week Bible verses. So when my mother was dying and I was her caregiver, it was a difficult time. But what was my mantra that came back to me, it wasn't exactly my higher voice, but maybe it was this verse, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And that was something I repeated in my head and gave me a lot of peace at the end of the day after I'd been taking care of my mother. And I had a peace inside of me that I let go and let God to, I knew my mother was dying, but I wanted to help as much as I could all the way till the end. And so that was really helpful for me to listen to that. And I'm sure all of you have got, during difficult times, things that you listen to or read, like the Serenity Prayer is one that we talked about before. That's very helpful. Yeah, so to fall back on things that I learned as a child helps me as an adult.
Uh-huh. What else? How about the rest of you?
Well, Jim, reading part of that book also talked about listening to your head or listening to your heart. And I kind of come to the conclusion that yes, the head is available to make what I call logic decisions with cold facts. However, to listen to yourself, listen to your heart. I think that's called the inner self.
Yeah.
When you listen to your heart, then you really get a feeling of what you want to do. Yeah, your head's there with all the facts and knowledge and maybe some experience, but it's your heart that's going to tell you what to do. That's just my feeling.
Yeah. And all of the decisions that we make can't just be made because they're logically the right answer, because they're responsibly the right answer. All those head ways of doing things. That's not a bad voice to listen to, but sometimes it is not the only voice of self that we need to hear. You know, if we did what was logical, probably none of us would ever step into a relationship. You know what I'm saying? Because you have to be a little illogical to step into that space, right? You have to follow a different voice within you, don't you? And it's not a bad voice, but it is a very different voice. Because things like this happen all the time. See, my wife is calling me right now, and this is an inconvenient time to talk with her. It often does that. It draws us into inconvenient spaces sometimes, doesn't it? And we have to figure out when it is time for that, right? And the hard part is I think, no, let me say it a different way. The easy way to do things sometimes is to trust that which is we see as our expert. And that expert is usually outside of ourselves. But I like what she called the expert. Did you hear? Let me see if I can read it here. A gay British interior decorator with impossibly high standards. Right? Something that is obviously not you, that is calling you to be something that is not your standard. And how do you say to that person who has lots of competence and lots of ability and lots of taste, how do you say to that, but I'm listening to a different voice today? Yesterday, I told a story at the devotional service. I told a story from the Buddhist tradition about the horse trainer who walked with a limp. And he did a good job training his horses, but he also, the emperor also noticed that each of the horses was developing a limp because they were following the one training them. And your best trainers, those expert voices that you have, no matter how good they are, have a limp, especially compared to your voice. Sometimes they're speaking their own voice really well, but they're not speaking your voice. And so they're going to give you something that makes you less than what you are. And so are you going to listen to your voice, or are you only going to copy their voice? And the learning from their voice is not a bad thing, but it also carries the limp with it. How do you hear the true, authentic you voice? And how do you trust that more than the expert? How have you done that in the past? Who's had experience with trying that?
Does that have to be a dichotomy?
Oh,
I
it's
mean,
not.
to me, I use both. I use head and I use things that, I mean, I try and make informed decisions. I follow my heart, but then I also research something and figure out the expert part of it also. So I
Right.
do a little bit of both. I mean, I put them together.
That's right. You're exactly right. Each of these chapters, you know, because last week we talked about listening to others, doesn't mean that we forget chapter 1 where we listen to nature. Right? We have to do all of this listening as we go along. Next week we're going to not next week, but 2 weeks from now we're going to talk about listening to the ones who have gone before us. Right? Those are important voices to hear, but you don't want any of them to eclipse any of the others. And so you definitely don't want to trust the expert at the expense of hearing your own expert, that which is inside of you. And the hard part is that sometimes experts can be really demanding. Like pastors can say, I'm the one that really knows God because I've trained, I know how to do it. Right? Have you ever had a pastor be that way? And it's not that we don't have really good conceptions of, but what does your voice say in the light of pastor's voice? That's what this is saying.
Jim, did you want to go over the sections in the chapter like we did yesterday?
Sure. Do you want to do your sections first or?
Sure.
Yeah.
On page 132 is painter as listener. There were several that I could have chosen, but that was the one that I liked. She says, my practice is to sit, breathe, and listen. And, you know, I think that's really important when we're trying to listen to ourselves. You got to be quiet in order to hear. So I practice to sit, breathe, and listen. My writing is an art form meant to be shared. I put the ink pen to the page and listen to hear the words and write what I hear. So I thought that was pretty cool. As a visual artist, I'll put my brush in hand and do the overview and decide, okay, what color looks right. And in a way, I'm listening to that inner self without realizing it. The process, though, of mark making is similar to writing words. It's just imagery. But I think that energy of listening, whether it's words or painting or advice, you need to be quiet. You need to be able to shut out whatever it is you're around, televisions, iPads, iPhones, the phone, you know, the barking dog, and go somewhere where it's quiet. I was there at church today. I wanted to just put this in there. I walked around in the quiet. Jim had said, you know, you can be at church, you know, and there's nobody else around. And I walked to the fire pit and I went on the labyrinth and I looked inside the church, and it was really a lovely space to be quiet. So I just want to encourage you to do that if you're looking for a place where you can listen to yourself.
Know that we have lots of good listening spaces here at St. Francis, and I'm so thankful for all the people who have helped make those things be true about this space we've given to each other, because there's wonderful spaces to listen. So come at any time. If you want a wise voice, you can always knock on the door and listen to Melissa.
That was good.
Did you want to take the last section there? I'm looking at the clock and thinking we better move on.
Yeah, I want to talk about the one section that, you know, probably is in some ways closest to my heart, and that's the one called Minister as Listener. But what was interesting about that section, if you remember that section, is she sits down with her minister friend and they listened in a very different way. Is it a God around me or a God within me? Well, and maybe the answer is maybe, right? That it doesn't have to be one or the other. Are you trying to listen both ways? Or have you tried the one so much that that's no longer the way you can hear, that now you try the other? Right?
Just so you know, it's on page 135.
Thank
If you're
you.
following along in the book. And there's a wonderful try this on page 137 that connects with what you're saying, Jim.
Yeah. What they get down to is, I believe in a listening God. So whether that listening ear is inside of you or around you and is speaking out of that listening they do of your life, that interaction is important, right? Do you step into however you are hearing that? And Lamont said that she believes that God essentially has a plan for her and she's trying to hear that plan. And her friend essentially said, I believe I learn a plan as I listen. And so it's more her coming up with the plan, not hearing God's plan, but her coming up with the plan. Either way is a good way of listening, but it's listening beyond self, right? Or no, listening to self differently. It's listening to that divine voice in somehow wrapped around within self, if that makes sense. When you read through here, which of these sections made an impact on you? Which ones were important to you? Don't talk yet about the try this, because I want to come back to that in just a second, because they were marvelous and I want to talk about some of them. But which of the reading parts were important to you?
For me, on page 134, on the first paragraph there, almost all the way through, says, I think love asks us to listen to the words, to the space between the words, the silence. We are asked to listen beyond our comfort zone, to listen to the unknown, into vulnerability. For me to listen into the unknown, into for me, it's in the listening that I have the strength, the willingness, and courage to go to the dance of love, the practice of art. That was to me the most, I guess, the most profound few sentences in the whole book so far.
Nice.
To me.
Yeah, good sentences. The hard part about any of those types of sentences like that is they draw you beyond yourself, beyond the easy self that you've set up, and into your deeper self, which is exactly what we want to do, isn't it? Anyone else?
So this is Judith, and I have a practice of, there are 4 Australian pistache trees in the park that I love, and I go and I hug them and tell them I love them. Well, after I read this on page 117 about the trees, then I thought, well, what about asking them if they had anything to say to me?
What
Of
if?
course, I can't tell you anything that they said, but just the idea that I asked, I felt good about.
Yeah, but haven't you enjoyed what Mike and Nancy have been reading every single week? The book about
Oh yes,
listening.
much the children's time. Yes,
Right, that
yes.
children's time. I think that listening to that higher self takes some patience, takes some time for us. Partially because we already know how to listen to what we already listened to.
Yep.
But that we're trying to hear something more.
You know, that book caused a discussion between Mike and myself. Okay, what are the ants saying, and the lizard and the sand? And, you know, we had to kind of answer that question for ourselves. What are you listening to from those critters that have something to share? And that, you know, really was a good conversation. It's not an easy answer to come up with. How can a lizard teach you to listen?
Yeah. So I think that's what our exercises, the try this exercises are kind of about, is about truly valuing parts of yourself that that might be speaking differently than what you're used to. One of the ones that was interesting for me was the one in the section called quelling anxiety. And the try this was listen to something that gives you anxiety and be in that listening space that we sometimes try to stay away from, that we don't want to be anxious. But is that a space where life is trying to speak to us or help ourselves speak and hear differently? Right?
Could you give an example, Jim?
Well, let me give an example of someone who's sitting in the room. Siri, you've had to go through both mom and dad's deaths in the last couple of years. Those are some places of not perfect, easy paths. Some anxiety exists there. But did you become anything in that listening process? Did it help you to grow?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, I mean, it certainly, it did. It's impossible to go through this kind of, experience and not have it cause me to grow. It's so disorienting.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time, and my dad died 5 weeks ago, and so I'm still just kind of coming out of it. And I noticed moments where I seem to be a little bit more normal, more present, and this one is going easier than when my mom passed away. And I wanted to say something when Nancy, you were talking about how to listen to the lizard. Because I have several box turtles and a desert tortoise. And when I'm just really out of sorts, I will go in the backyard when they're not hibernating like right now, but soon they will be awake again. And I just sit and I watch them. And oftentimes they're not even really doing anything. They're sitting spread out, stretched out in one way or another, doing what I call turtle yoga. And I feel like the energy that's flowing through them when I really am present enough to pay attention. And so it's interesting, but the moments when they're moving, it's like, that's when it's like more like, a Homo sapiens. I kind of get something's going on. But it's taken me years because I've had them for like more than 25 years. I've had box turtles and of just being present and just watching them and watching the little subtleties and the way that they act, the way that they respond to their environment, the way that they're very aware, like I'll do something and they seem to be looking in a totally different direction. And then what I did, they will do something in response. I wish I could think of an example, but when I really pay attention, there's so much more going on out there in nature than I'm even aware of normally.
So at least part of what I heard is one of the exercises, and this is not obviously the whole of what you were saying, Siri, but it talked about an interaction where you felt guided. And so what I hear in turtles, you have seen guidance in the past. And so it's a place that can help you to figure out where is guidance right now. Maybe in the same turtle voice that you heard it before, but it also can give you insights into how to hear guidance today.
Yeah.
Right? And how do we go back to those places that have guided us, not to get the same answer, but to figure out how to listen today. So thank you. Really well done. Many of these things are asking you to just choose a different way or to choose a deeper way in the midst of it. Be very deliberate and intentional about what you're doing. Slow your pace and look for revelations was one of them, right? Question the ways that you were taught to think about God. Remember, there's the one interaction where it says, choose 5 traits that you were taught at some point or another, that this is what God is. and then rethink them. Are they still the traits that you want to have? Or maybe more importantly, are the subtleties of those traits the same as before? So like I grew up singing songs like Onward Christian Soldiers, where God is the warrior king type of thing. Especially when you couple that to the term that we often use, the omnipotent, right? The all-powerful, which often becomes the beat up your enemies type of language. And so when I went to seminary, so what if the power of that all-powerful of God is in the loving side of God? That God is all-powerful and loving, not in defeating the enemy. And so just that subtle change of how to view that word allowed me to grasp the answers differently than before.
You know, Jim, on 137, that try this that you're talking about, they define God as kind, funny, wise, gentle, generous. And I thought, you know, how is God funny? And then I thought of the marquee that's in front of our church, and it says, let life surprise you. And sometimes it is a humorous surprise when, you know, you get a call from a long lost friend and they have something funny going on in their life. In some ways it shows me surprise and just the humor of God, which is, you know, and not a term I would ever associate with God before. It was always God is serious and almighty, but what about surprise and humor and joy, fun.
Yeah.
That's a part of God too, and a part of us. And I think when we listen to those parts of ourselves, I think our lives can be richer and can take on new directions.
So a lot of this section is learning to trust the wise one within you. I look around the room here and I see wise people. Not that I always treat you as if you are, but I see wise people. And I want you to sometimes not trust my voice or Nancy's voice or somebody else's voice. I want you to learn to trust that wise person that I have often heard speak out of your body. I like the voices that you are. I like the ways you have enhanced my life. And I guess what my deepest wish is for you is that you let that voice enhance your life as well. So this week, as well as reading the next chapter, chapter 4, go back to the exercises and read through them again, practice them again. Take some time delving deep into the wonder of who you are, right? Noting one of the ones was about noting the hot spots, right? The places where you're aflame right now. And that aflame can be aflame with excitement or inflamed with pain. Note those spaces and listen to those spaces. Hear yourself. And don't hear the same as what you did hear, but be ready to listen to the more of yourself. Okay?
Okay.
I like who you are.
Mhm.
We like who you are too, Jim.
All right, my friends, thank you for a time together. We will see each other in 2 weeks for this class, but there's a few things going on next week in case you want to see my beautiful face.
Easter. Woo-hoo.
All right. Take care, my friends.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.